So we're about a third of the way through this book, and I really hope you guys are enjoying it as much as I am. I think it gives a really different perspective than we had read with Number of the Stars and some of the other Holocaust literature that we have dove into. So we're going to go ahead and keep reading on to Chapter 9 today. Chapter 9, The Hospital. One fateful afternoon in October, as I sat in the laundry with sewing on my lap, I heard a whiz, boom, crash that was so close the ground rocked back and forth. Had a bomb hit the work camp? Ingy turned off her giant steam press and ran outside. I followed her as she trotted between the buildings until she got to the open area. A few policemen had already gathered. Julie was there as well, standing rigid in her white smock. Her eyes searched in the direction of town. Julie pointed. That's where it hit. I shaded my eyes with one hand and squinted so I could see farther. Curls of smoke rose a mile or so beyond our barbed wire enclosure. Officer Schmidt stepped out of the administrative building and walked to where we stood. It's the metalworks factory, he said to the police officer. I was just notified. Luca and Xenia worked at the metalwork factory. My heart pounded in fear for them. Officer Schmidt turned to Ingy. Other buildings in town have been hit as well, so they're scrambling to provide first aid. Everyone who can be spared needs to get to the entrance. They'll be bringing the injured laborers back to the camp for treatment, and many will need to be carried to the hospital. Ingy nodded. I'll round up the kitchen workers and stretchers. She turned to me and said, Lita, you're too small to carry any of the injured. Go to the hospital now with that worker, she pointed at Julie, and help her make up the extra beds. Then she dashed off to the kitchen. Come on, said Julie, grabbing my hand. The hospital was the last place on earth I wanted to be. I had no choice. When we got there, Julie held the door open and pulled me in. The first thing I noticed was the strong smell of bleaching powder, and I found this comforting. At least it was clean. The entryway was a small room with wooden benches along. Oops, sorry guys. Here we are, right here. The entryway was a small room with wooden benches along the wall and a glassed-in reception area beside a second door. Julie nodded to the white uniformed woman behind the glass and then opened the second door, which revealed a series of rooms on either side of a long, wide corridor. I followed her down the painted concrete floors of the hallway, glancing fearfully into each room as we passed. Everything looked so normal. Each room held 8 or so wooden beds with straw mattresses similar to the bunks in our barracks. Only these were neatly made with good white cotton sheets, and instead of being stacked in tiers, they were all on the floor. The first room was empty, but in the second, 2 of the hospital beds were occupied. The man and the woman had a uniformity about them, but were gaunt and motionless, looking more like corpses than patients. No nurse or doctor was in attendance. Are those people forced laborers? I whispered to Julie. She frowned and put a finger to her lips. Who would hear us? But just then a couple of nurses and a man in a white coat stepped out of a room at the end of the hallway. The doctor took no notice of us, but carefully noted something on his clipboard as he slowly walked with the nurses down the hallway towards us. He looked up as we drew closer to the group. I see they gave you a girl to help you make up the other rooms. Yes, Herr Doctor, said Julie, nodding to him in deference. Do it quickly, then. The train with the injured is on its way. He and the nurses continued down the hallway and went out through the door. Julie took out a stack of clean sheets from a linen cupboard and handed them to me. I followed her into one of the next rooms. I didn't think anyone would be able to hear us as we worked, so I tried to ask Julie again about the patients, keeping my voice low just in case. They're Germans, she whispered. They're being slowly starved to death. I could barely hide my shock. Why would the Nazis starve Germans? They are no longer useful, said Julie. The woman was a warden. She has advanced cancer, and the man has a head injury. He used to be one of the police. I continued to make the bed in silence, but my mind tumbled with conflicting thoughts and fear. A hospital was supposed to be a place of healing, but it was at a hospital that my sister was taken from me. At this hospital, some patients had been treated for injuries, but healthy children had been killed for their blood. Now here were Nazis using hospitals to kill even Germans they considered not useful. It seemed that everyone was a piece of a big machine, and if you stopped working, you were thrown out. What part of the machine was my sister being used for? She was so much younger than me. How useful could she possibly be? A dozen terrifying scenarios fluttered through my imagination. Could Larissa survive? I made a final snug corner on the sheet of the last bed and put my hands on my hips, regarding all the newly made-up beds. Would this room be used for healing or killing? I heard the chugging of the train as it approached. Let's go, said Julie. As I walked beside her to meet the train, all I could think of was that hospital. I didn't envy Julie, having to work there every day. It had to be horrible for her to witness things she had no way of stopping. The image of those two dying Germans was burned into my mind. If the doctors and nurses were supposed to make them die, why such a long process as starving them? My memory flashed back to when I was little and the Nazis had taken all the Jews and shot them in broad daylight. They had shot my mother that way as well. It seemed that just as there were different soups, there were different ways of being killed, depending on your nationality. The cook and other kitchen workers had gathered in the front of the gate with stretchers. The doctor was talking rapidly to the workers, gesturing with his hands. The nurses stood close by, waiting for their orders. These women reminded me of the nurses who had separated me from Larissa. Were they here to assist the injured, or were they more interested in sorting through them? I thought of them as big white vultures circling, looking for scraps of meat. The train pulled up, and one by one, survivors limped out of the train cars, gashes of red on their scalps and arms. Some held on to each other for support, trying to look less injured than they were. The nurses dispersed among the wounded, assisting those on the spot who just needed first aid, dispensing a bandage here and a quick stitches there. Those more seriously injured were seen by the doctors. Just then, Xenia got off the train. She was cradling her left arm. Her dress hung in shreds, and she was splattered with blood. But she was walking. I wanted to help her, but Julie held me back. Don't call attention to yourself, she said. It will not help your friend. The doctor walked up to Xenia and did a quick examination of her arm. Surface scratches only, he said. You're lucky. He called a nurse over to dress Xenia's cuts and went on to someone else. The nurse roughly swabbed the deep scrapes on Xenia's arm with a disinfectant, then bound it up. "You can recuperate in your barracks," she said, turning to another worker. Xenia's face was white and covered with a sheen of sweat. I think she was probably relieved that her injuries were minor, but she still looked like she was in pain. She walked to where Julia and I stood. I guess she wanted to prove that she was still useful. I put my arm around her. "Let me help you to our barracks," I said. "No," she said, trembling. "I'd like to stand here and assist if necessary." The next train car pulled up and the doors opened. 2 laborers carried out a third by the arms and legs. I stood on tiptoes and was horrified to see the one being carried was Luca. "Stretcher," said the doctor, waving his hand to the kitchen worker. The cook and his assistant set the stretcher on the ground, and the 2 OST workers gingerly lowered Luca onto it. From where I stood, I could see that the entire top portion of one leg was covered in blood. His arms and face were also spattered, but seemed uninjured. "Luca!" I cried. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around for me, but Julie held my arm so tightly that I couldn't run to him. The doctor examined him quickly. "To the hospital," he said. My heart sank. Would he be treated or killed? I turned my face to Julie, but she refused to look at me. More slaves were taken to the hospital. "I have to go help them," said Julie, her voice crackling. She left Xenia and me standing there. I wrapped my arm around Xenia's waist. "No," she said, pushing me away. "I must walk on my own." Once we were in the privacy of our barracks, she collapsed onto her bunk in a quivering mound of pain. What could I possibly do to help her? I grabbed my own blankets and covered her up. Then I got my tin cup and ran outside and got some water. I helped her drink a little bit and held her until she fell asleep. By the morning whistle, I was woken by Xenia's hands on my shoulder. "Look," she said, her eyes filled with tears. She had wrapped herself in one of the blankets. She held out what was left of her dress. Her tossing and turning in the night had caused even more shredding to her already threadbare dress. It was beyond repair and basically unwearable. I tore off the bottom strip of my own tattered dress and stitched that in place to make the top of hers decent. At roll call, those who were wounded were given alternate duties. Xenia was sent to work in the kitchen. I went back to the laundry, worried sick about Xenia. She wasn't as physically injured as many were, but I knew that the bombing had shattered her. I was especially worried about Luca. I counted the hours until lunch when I could ask Julie about him. Ingi acted as if the bombing had never happened. In fact, that morning she looked happier than I had ever seen her. "I've received a package from my husband," she said, her eyes shining like a child's on St. Nicholas Day. She went into her office room and came back with an armful of extraordinary finery. A butter-colored chiffon blouse with intricate lace at the bodice, a set of 6 monogrammed ladies' handkerchiefs, and a heavy black fur coat. The items seemed so out of keeping with life as I knew it at the camp, and it made me wonder what Ingi did when she left here each day after the 6 o'clock whistle. None of the items needed mending, as far as I could tell. "They're beautiful." I placed a fingertip on the lace. "Aren't they, though?" said Ingi. "My husband is fighting in France, and he sends me the most wonderful things." I knew all about the Nazi soldiers and how they stole. In my hometown of Vernanscha, we had no fur coats worthy of stealing.